Before we get started, let us acknowledge that if we were at Old North, we would be on land that had been the home and the hunting grounds of the Massachusetts tribe. By the time Old North was built in 1723, the Massachusetts people had been decimated by disease and by war, and they had been displaced from their land. And yet they survive. Their story is one of suffering and of community, of silence and resilience, and it is one that we should learn from. So let's let history be our instructor. Thank you for being part of tonight's speaker series event. We are really thrilled to have a full house tonight and to be welcoming so many new faces. At Old North, we embrace the concept of engaging with hard history. And what I mean by that is that we look to tell and interpret stories both on site and digitally that ask us to embrace complication, to become a little bit comfortable with being uncomfortable. We ask lifelong learners like yourselves to engage with nuance and context. And we think that by doing so, it becomes easier for us to understand the present and to chart the course to a better future for all of us. So in that light, I will announce that next month on Thursday, November 17th, we will have Professor David Silverman talking about the tumultuous and occasionally troubling and very complicated history of the holiday Thanksgiving. So Thanksgiving's identity has changed many times over the centuries, and Dr. Silverman, an expert in the Wampanoag people, will be talking to us about that. But tonight, we have Dr. Emerson Baker. Tad is a professor at Salem State University, is the author or co-author of 6 books, has been the on-screen expert or consultant for many documentaries and television programs. His book, A Storm of Witchcraft, is gripping and thought-provoking. And tonight he will be talking to us about the Salem witch trials as a product of many factors, but of an abject failure of leadership. So it is my great pleasure to introduce Tad Baker and invite him to take it away. If you have questions, please do put them in the chat. We will be doing Q&A at the end.
Thank you, Catherine. It's great to be with you folks. And yeah, this is difficult history. And I guess I'll sort of preface what I say by saying that I teach the Salem witch trials all the time. And it becomes, every time I teach it, it becomes more and more a course about social justice, I think, and maybe less about history, but it's certainly a lot going on there. Can you see my screen? Thumbs up? Great, okay. So, initial problem may be the human condition. Almost every society throughout history has hit witch hunts of one form or another. In Europe, during the Great Age of Witch Hunts between about 1400 and the American Revolution, about 100,000 people are in fact tried for witchcraft, and about half of them are executed. So many that we really don't have precise numbers or all the names by any stretch. Many of them are hunted in huge witch hunts where hundreds, or in some cases even several thousand people die over months or even years. So this is what we're looking at is sort of the tip of the iceberg of a much bigger picture. And more than 100 people actually were accused of witchcraft in New England before Salem in 1692. And in fact, from 1647 to 1688, 13 people were executed for witchcraft in Connecticut and Massachusetts. And by the way, up until that point, there have been more people executed for witchcraft in Connecticut than Massachusetts. But these were substantially different than Salem or, in fact, those European witch hunts, because in most cases, only 1 or 2 people are accused of witchcraft. And as you can see, in most cases, they don't end up being convicted or sentenced to death. But certainly it's a persistent problem reflective of many ways of the nature of society. Some of the issues maybe we'll sort of deal with tonight. So Salem is really something that's significantly different. It is by far the largest witchcraft crisis in American history. And again, by European standards, really, it's not considered, Europeans wouldn't even consider it a large outbreak, but that doesn't lessen the tragedy here. I do like to point out that in the process of writing the book, I realized that Roger Toothaker, one of the 5 people who died in prison, was my like 9th great uncle, right? So I'm certainly sympathetic to the cause. But again, when in places in Europe where you have hundreds of people dying, I could give a whole nother talk about why Salem the Witch city. We'll leave it at that. But tonight, what we really want to do is try to focus more on sort of that issue of leadership. Anyhow, we know that at least 172 people were accused of witchcraft, many cases being informally pried out upon. Of these, 156 have surviving legal proceedings. We have over 900 documents, but it's by no means a complete record. And most of us who study this are pretty sure that at least some of the records were probably deliberately destroyed, maybe in the aftermath or in the early 18th century by embarrassed families. 19 people were executed. 1, Giles Corey, of course, pressed to death. And again, at least 5 die in jail. So something clearly went wrong here, much more so than in previous outbreaks of witchcraft in New England. And I think it's fair to say that a significant element of that is this failure of leadership that we will get to. But just sort of tip my hat a bit on that. I want to talk specifically about local officials, and especially Reverend Samuel Parris. And also I want to talk about the 9 judges of the Court of Oyer and Terminer, especially Chief Justice William Stoughton. And really kind of the buck ultimately stops with the governor of the colony, Sir William Phipps, and failures at all levels to protect innocent lives. And the result is the Salem crisis and the Salem tragedy, one that really affected families involved for generations afterwards. So first, what happened? Well, before we get to leadership, because I know people always want to get sort of my take on how do we explain this, this unprecedented level of witch hunt. Well, I titled my book A Storm of Witchcraft, really because it took a perfect storm to create America's largest witch hunt. And really you have to have, like that other great Essex County tragedy, the perfect storm, where many people were killed in the fishing fleet. You have to have lots of things go bad at the same time. And short answer is, I'm going to give you sort of a thumbnail idea of some of the key themes in the book, but the center of the Salem outbreak was in Salem Village, which, by the way, today, presently, ironically, is actually now Danvers, right? And most people in Danvers say they're pretty happy that when they became a separate town, their name changed, and you had a very different sense of the witch trials if you go to Danvers today. They don't have 100,000 people take to the streets on Saturdays in October like you do in downtown Salem. Let's just leave it at that. Anyhow, Salem Village was a sort of a parish of Salem in the late 17th century. They had recently hired their own minister starting in 1672. And by 1692, they were on their 4th minister in 20 years. And all sorts of conflict going on in the parish, really sort of religious and political conflict, as one letter writer wrote, who lived there complaining, neighbor against neighbor, brother against brother. So this is where most of the initial accusations take place, and it's sort of a hotbed of problems. And if it was just that, again, maybe 1 or 2 people would have been accused, and that might have been the end of it. But there's more factors on top of this. We have colony-wide political instability throughout Massachusetts. In January of 1692, Massachusetts hears that Increase Mather and William Phipps are coming home from England. They've been trying for several years to get a new charter for the colony of Massachusetts. There'll be a new government formed, but that raised a lot of questions for people. People were worried, what would that government look like? Phipps is kind of this outsider. He's this Maine guy, this kind of a wild card, barely literate, never held office before. People are worried. Wolfgang Behringer, great witchcraft historian, says you need 2 things to go bad to have a big witchcraft problem. And one is colony-wide political instability, and the other is bad weather. Because in a pre-modern society where people grow their own food, if you have horrible weather, you have crop failure, you have famine, you have starvation, you have inflation, all kinds of bad problems. And that'll be okay if you have a good government to help you. But in 1692, people were worried about their government, and that's when the accusations start to fly. And this is all done in a background of perceived decline by the Puritans, of decline of their spiritual nature of their community. They believed that they had a special relationship with God, a special covenant, and that they had sort of may have fallen from that vow, that by the second and third generation of colonists in 1692, those younger generations seemed to lack the fervor of their parents. And they didn't attend church as regularly, even though they were required to do so. Children weren't going to school as much to learn to read. And why do you go to school in Massachusetts to learn to read? You learn to read the Bible. So there was a real fear that there had been a lot of decline. Now, the fact that Massachusetts made such a big deal about this probably says the decline wasn't that great. It was still a very devout colony as places went, especially even, compared to other American colonies. Excuse me. But it was an issue for people, and they were very much worried that God would let Satan loose in their colony as a test of their spirituality, right? So on top of that, again, we do have the worst weather of the generation in recorded memory, with the worst years of the Little Ice Age in the 1680s, where you have in the early 1690s, horrible, cold, nasty winters. Top that off with early frosts, killer frosts just after you've done planting in the spring, hot, dry summers that kill crops, and then a killer frost in August, which again takes out whatever's left. So, and by the way, to Puritans, before the age of science, everything is a sign of God's pleasure or displeasure. So the bad weather itself is going to be not just an economic problem, but also a spiritual problem, a sign of problems in their relationship with God. So you have inflation, high taxes, and economic failure. And to top that off, military disaster. Because in 1692, Massachusetts has been engaged for over 3 years with a war on the northern frontier in Maine and parts of New Hampshire with the Wabanaki, the native peoples of northern New England, and their French allies coming down from Quebec and also Acadia. And the enemy is winning this war. And that's a big problem, particularly too, because this isn't just a military conflict where most of the settlements in Maine have been abandoned. But also, if you look at who's attacking Puritan New England, it is the French Catholics. What the Puritans had a near pathological hatred of the Pope and what they perceived of as his minions, that is, good, God-fearing Catholics. And again, that's worth a whole nother lecture in its own right to understand the sort of the hatred and bigotry of the Puritans there. But so they were terrified that their Puritan experiment was being ended by the Catholics, in league with who? With Native Americans, who tended to be pagans, or if they had converted to Christianity, were Catholic, which again the Puritans might have seen as actually being worse than just being a pagan. So all of these factors come into play. Military disaster includes increasing in taxes. It includes all sorts of displacement. A lot of people involved in the witch trials are people displaced from Maine. I will say one thing though up front though, too, because I know I'm going to ask this question. It was not ergot poisoning, but we'll get to that too. So what caused the afflictions and the accusations? Well, there's no real simple answer. It's a long, complicated story, but I just want to hit on some of what I think are sort of the salient points of this. And by the way, I think a lot of the stuff, there are a lot of really good books on the Salem witch trials. And frankly, many of them are written by friends of mine because there's a small group of us who study this stuff. And probably about 95% of it, we see pretty much eye to eye, sort of just little different variances in interpretation. So I'll just hit some of the highlights of my kind of interpretations here. But I'll tell you, there's really no simple answers. And what you're getting here is one aspect of a 15-week graduate course, which still doesn't cover all the bases, right? So anyhow, it's clear to me that, and again, I have no training in psychology or medicine, but it's really clear that a key culprit here is conversion disorder or mass conversion disorder, something that in the good old days was called mass hysteria, but that is an extremely gendered and unfortunate term, and by its very nature suggests that men can't be hysterical. Well, yeah, we know that's certainly true, and that certainly happened in 1692. But mass conversion disorder really is a controversial diagnosis then as now, and again, trying to diagnose people that have been dead for 300 years is kind of tough, but the symptoms really seem to fit, because what we're talking about is mental stresses, where people in Salem Village, and particularly starting initially with the family of the minister, Reverend Paris, his daughter and his niece, are undergoing huge mental stress and anguish. And what happens is under such conditions is, our minds are incredibly powerful things. And in conversion disorder, your mind literally takes over when it's feeling this anguish and converts that mental anguish into physical symptoms. Now, I want to make clear, hence the term conversion disorder, this is not faking or children acting out, because the people who are doing this have no idea what's going on or why, they're barking like a dog or feel like someone's stabbing pins into them or throwing themselves into the fire, all kinds of horrible things. And frankly, that unknowing makes the situation worse. It increases their anxiety, and it just grows because no one can explain what's going on. And what's interesting about mass conversion disorder is that experts today acknowledge that the target population is teenagers, and predominantly teenage girls. And having two wonderful daughters, my wife and I of our own, who've made it into adulthood, and we're very proud of them. I think today we ask an awful lot of girls and young women, the stresses that and the expectations of society. Having said that, it was far worse in the 17th century. And if you really look in a patriarchal society run by the ministers, run by the men, very hierarchical, young women and girls were really outsiders into this system. And it's not surprising that under circumstances, they might suffer some disorder like conversion disorder. What's intriguing about conversion disorder too is it usually starts with high status people, high status girls, teenagers. It's a famous case, about 10 years ago in Leroy, New York, in upstate New York, which was sort of a post-industrial town that was sort of down on its luck, the kind of place where parents were losing jobs and teenage pregnancy and all those sorts of stresses. And in Leroy, when they had a case of mass conversion disorder, which again was very controversial and no one wanted to accept the diagnosis, they were saying like, oh, it's that toxic landfill on the edge of town. But eventually they realized it was mass conversion disorder. And the first people to be affected by it, the cheerleaders in the high school, right? And again, usually mass conversion disorder starts with high status people who get copied, right? And in many high schools, it will be those cheerleaders, and then it goes down and out the ladder, and all of a sudden, other people, other girls in particular, are feeling the same symptoms. And again, no idea why, right? Not faking it. Now in Salem Village, again, the first accused are the daughter and niece of the minister, Reverend Paris. Wow. The most high status girls in Salem Village, because their father figure is the leader of the community, Reverend Paris. So I certainly think that's a factor. And in fact, even more so to point out that witchcraft is really very much of a gendered crime. And again, if you look at witchcraft throughout history, it's the same way. Overwhelmingly, usually around 3/4 of the people accused are women. In Salem, it's actually 76%. And it's even worse than that because most of the men who are accused tend to be relatives of women who've been accused, because witchcraft was believed to travel in families, or men who would be so foolish as to defend women who were accused. And most people would then begin to question like, wow, you're a God-fearing Christian. Why on earth would you defend a witch? As opposed to someone saying like, wow, here's some good Christian folk who are defending these people and saying they're our neighbors. And, there's even some cases in Salem Village where there's some people who are political opponents of Rebecca Nurse, but they signed the petition. In other words, you know what? I don't agree with she and her husband's politics, but they're good people. They're not witches. They're not worthy of a witch hunt. We just have our disagreements. Again, something to sort of ponder, I think, there, right? And what bravery it took to sign your name to a petition like that, where, who knows when they might come knocking on your door next. We could talk a long time about why women, but again, the simple part is that, we're talking about a traditional pre-modern patriarchal society. Women are considered to be imperfect vessels. And again, I can't emphasize how foolish and wrong that is today. But in the 17th century, it is absolutely believed, and that women were the weaker vessel, made from Adam's rib, and that, of course, more susceptible to Satan's wiles, right? And to be willing to become one of his minions. So certainly gender plays a huge role in the witch trials. And in fact, the key group of accusers have traditionally been known as the afflicted girls. I put quotes in it for a couple of reasons, because we are talking a group of about a dozen or so people. Most of them are girls and young women, roughly between the ages of maybe like 16 and 20. But we know there's at least a couple of one man, Tituba's husband, John Indian, and also Judge Corwin's son is afflicted. One of the judges of the 9 judges of the Court of Oyer and Terminer. This is English law, but it's right. And so some pieces of it we wouldn't recognize, like they didn't have conflict of interest laws, as we'll see. And also, too, even a couple of adult women, who were around 40 years of age, were part of this circle of accusers as well. So in that sense, and it's kind of odd, because in most cases, women would not necessarily even be testifying in court, but in this case, they certainly play a prominent role. But I'd also say, too, that they're also, and I think, you can't watch a documentary or The Crucible or anything on Salem without seeing the afflicted girls writhing on the floor and screaming and yelling, which frankly is really overblown and overplayed. And also, too, though, many men were involved in the accusations, but they are what we'd consider more typical accusations of witchcraft, harming people and property, through lightning and storms, or the use of poppets, that is image magic, preternatural knowledge, more traditional sorts of witchcraft, as we would sort of think of. So again, there were hundreds of people involved in the accusations in Salem. But the focus really has been on those afflicted girls who led, and if you look at them as a group, they led a pretty tough, stressful life. Again, most of them late teens. Many of them are servants in some of the wealthier households in Salem Village. Quite a few are war refugees, where they have had to flee from the main frontier. In many cases, they are orphans or have lost parents, or have brothers who are off fighting. And so these are really have become like working class girls, especially if they've lost their homes or parents. And one example of this is Mercy Short, who had lost her family on the Salmon Falls raid in 1690. Salmon Falls being present-day Berwick, Maine, and Rollinsford, New Hampshire. And the village is attacked in the spring of 1690, and close to 100 people are killed or taken captive. Mercy Short, when her house is one of the first to be attacked, her parents are killed by the French and native raiders. She and maybe some siblings and other neighborhood children are gathered up and marched into Canada, forced, we think, to convert to Catholicism, and that we have their signatures in the baptism register in the churches in Quebec, and then ransomed back when families and the colony of the crown could come up with the money to basically do a prisoner exchange or to pay for them to come back. Mercy is afflicted in 1692 because by 1692 she's a menial servant in the house of a rich woman in Boston. And frankly, her life has been ruined. I mean, she's lost most of her family, and she had been from a fairly sort of sturdy yeoman farming family and probably had aspirations. Maybe she was going to marry the cute farming boy next door and raise a family. But frankly, the chances of her marrying at all may have gone almost out the window with this. And she is a menial servant with almost no prospects. And in 1692, when her mistress asks her to deliver some food to one of the accused witches in the jail in Boston, because the jails of Massachusetts were overflowing and they were everywhere. You have over 100 people, 150 people at one point in the jails. She's actually cursed by one of the witches, accused witches, Sarah Good, when she won't give Sarah Good tobacco when she asks for it. And at that point, Mercy essentially loses it. Modern today would say she freaks out. She really has a psychological break. And fortunately for her, minister is Cotton Mather, who tries to sort of counsel her and talk her through this. And fortunate for us, we have his description of her affliction. And in particular, she describes, she says, well, how did Satan tempt you? She says, well, Satan was a black man. Well, actually, no, he was tawny, like an Indian. And as you listen to this, she's basically reliving those horrible moments of the Salmon Falls raid when she lost her family and her life changed drastically and irreparably for the worse, right? And so, in her case, seems to be a classic case of post-traumatic stress disorder. And again, I think there are other people from the frontier and even people in Salem who were suffering from this as well, too, because in some cases, many people were afraid that Salem itself might be attacked. After all, places like Haverhill and even Billerica were attacked during this war. And in fact, people in Gloucester were so panicked that they thought the Native Americans and the French were attacking. And in fact, they weren't. But they actually thought they saw soldiers and they didn't. So these afflicted girls, also too, it seems fairly clear that they were suffering from verbal and physical abuse. In the 17th century was not a kinder or gentler time. A little, violence was acceptable to be used on children, on family members, husbands on wives, husbands and wives on children, and on servants. And if you didn't feel that your serving girl was performing her duties properly, well, cuffing her about a bit was okay. Not seriously harming them, but again, pretty miserable sort of situation to be in. And we know that some of these girls suffered in this way. And interestingly, most of the accused men who were tried for witchcraft had histories of violence of one kind or another. John Willard, executed for witchcraft. Amongst the testimony against him actually was a scene of him really beating his wife to within an inch of her life, to which she's running to the neighbor's house for help. That comes into the testimony of him behaving in very odd, bewitched kind of ways. George Burroughs, the former minister of Salem Village, who's accused, his wives' ghosts appear to the afflicted group, and they appear in their winding sheets covered in blood, that is, the sheets they were buried in. And they say that George killed them to these people, right? Now, of course, no one else could see them, only afflicted could see these spirits. But also, too, this sort of jived with some of the rumors about Burroughs because he was known for his strength and also his controlling ways. With one of those previous, very secretive, with one of those previous wives, he was known to censor her letters. She couldn't just write a letter to her father. George had to read through it first and make sure that she wasn't giving away any sort of secrets, apparently, right? So, and he was all, known for his strength and controlling. Not surprising, maybe, that people would say that, he killed his wives. Now, again, in the 17th century, unfortunately, many, many women died before their time. Infant mortality, about 25% of all children born don't reach the age of 18. And the toughest time of all, of course, is childbirth and right afterwards. And it was a happy but also scary moment when a wife was pregnant, because they were so excited about the new child, but also the fear that maybe the child and the mom, one of them or maybe both of them, might not make it, right? So it's not surprising that Burroughs would lose two wives. But again, with these other circumstances, you could make a case, right? And it certainly happened. Giles Corey, he is of course the fellow who has the unfortunate circumstance of being pressed to death when he refuses to agree to a trial by jury. But before this, in 1675, he had used Giles Corey. No one deserves to be pressed to death, especially when they're like 80 years old. But Giles Corey was not a nice guy. He was accused of committing arson on his neighbor John Proctor's house, for example. And in 1675, he had used his walking cane, to severely beat a young, simple-minded servant of his, a fellow named Jacob Goodell. Goodell actually died a few days later, and eventually Corey is eventually convicted of manslaughter. They couldn't prove that he'd really killed him, but he certainly may have contributed to it. And at the time, he gets off with a fine, right? He gets off pretty lightly. Interesting, isn't it? In 1692, Giles Corey apparition, that is his spirit or his specter, beats the girls, including his serving girl, with his staff. Not him. They don't. And she's not saying, "Oh no, he beat me." She's saying, "No, his specter beat me." Right? Because again, you don't want to say that your master is misbehaving, but it's okay to say his specter misbehaves. But I think, again, you can read between the lines here. And in fact, most of these serving girls make the same complaint. Take for example, John Proctor, who Giles' neighbor, who was executed. His servant, Mary Warren, accuses John Spector of threatening violence against him. Notice I said Mary Warren. Abigail is not his servant, as in the Crucible. Matter of fact, she's a little girl, about 9 or 10 years old, maybe. Anyhow, interesting about Mary Warren, because Mary Warren accuses John Spector of threatening him. The specter, again. And in fact, John Proctor himself admits that when Mary became afflicted, he threatened to thresh the devil out of her, to whip the nonsense out. And he threatens Mary, the specter threatens Mary with hot fire tongs to burn her out of her fit. And even more disturbing, he calls Mary his jade, which at the time could have been afraid for, like, you might call like a nag, a beaten up old horse, but it also was a slang term for a prostitute. And frankly, at the time, John Proctor's about 60 years old. His wife, his third wife, is pregnant with their child. And those aren't the kind of terms a guy like that should be calling his serving girl. And Mary actually testifies that John Spector comes up to her while she is sitting in the Proctor house, and she pulls his specter onto her lap. And, you know, that's just really is disturbing, right? And again, can I prove that there's some sort of sexual abuse going on there, or some sort of relationship? No, but there's a smoking gun there, certainly, right? So conversion, PTSD, abuse, and war hysteria, even that doesn't explain it all. It's certainly clearly there's some fraudulent accusations taking place, and indeed, probably more than we'd like to admit. Interesting, when the afflicted group are in the courtroom during the trials, which again is as an error that the judges really shouldn't be allowed to make. But they seem to become afflicted almost on cue when an accused witch enters the courtroom. All of a sudden, they become afflicted. Also, too, I should point out that if you did have one of these psychological mental conditions and came to your senses, as a matter of fact, Mary Warren kind of came to her senses in late spring. And she said, wow, I was out of my mind. I don't know what I was thinking. I'm better now. And said, these girls, they're crazy. At which point the afflicted girls start accusing her of being a witch, at which point Mary switches back to being afflicted because she's afraid of being a witch, or accused of being a witch. So that is to say, though, if people came to their senses after June 10th, it was too late. You had to play along, because by this point, poor Bridget Bishop has been executed for witchcraft. And you can no longer say, wow, I'm feeling better now, and but someone's already died, right? An innocent person has died. So that's certainly going on too. But again, not ergot poisoning. Ergot poisoning, this is an idea that came about in the about 1970. The idea is that actually people got their bread from rye. And if you had a pile of rye that gets damp, there's a natural mold that will grow on that rye, which produces a natural form of LSD. The theory went that if you ingest that, the afflicted were just having bad trips. They just got some bad bread, and it gave them LSD. Well, again, this doesn't make sense for a couple of grounds, and a lot of experts, including psychiatrists and MDs, have disproved it. Because it turns out, yeah, there is a type of ergot that does this. But in fact, there are a couple different types of ergot poisoning, and only one of them has the hallucinogenic side effects. And that's the one that does this to your body, right? You're basically gives you gangrene, where your skin sort of goes gangrenous, necrotizes, your limbs shrivel, blacken, fall off, and you die. No one mentions anything like this in 1692. And all but one or two of the afflicted girls seem to have lived to healthy, long lives. So that doesn't seem to fit at all. And again, I think someone might have mentioned something this horrific. And also, too, it doesn't fit if you think about it, because people were afflicted in Salem Village, in Andover, in Boston, even one person in Framingham. So were they all eating from that same one bad grain supply? No. Were there multiple grain supplies? Well, maybe, but why is it only one or two members of each family, right? And to me, it's kind of like, the idea of like coming up with that one sort of that silver bullet, that one perfect answer, and it just doesn't work. Is it possible that one or two people had something like this? Sure. Maybe they had a bad mushroom too. I don't know. But does that explain what's going on? No, absolutely not. And unfortunately, every TV show that does this has got to be ergot, right? Instead, it's really more historiographical. If you think about what's going on in the late 60s and early 70s, Timothy Leary and the hallucinogenic hippy-dippy drug cult is in sway. So, of course, this is that kind of interpretation of the Salem witch trials. And by the way, I don't accept encephalitis or Lyme disease being the chief culprit. But again, is it possible that one or two people were suffering from something like that? Sure, that's possible. Okay, Professor Baker, it isn't that, but we know the real reason. It was to get their land, right? No. Now, there is a kernel of truth here, like most of these things, right? Yes, in 1692, as the new government comes in and has to create a new set of laws, Massachusetts is temporarily under English common law. And under English common law, a felon's personal possessions, things like clothing, livestock, furniture, could be seized. However, their house and real estate could not be taken, even if they are executed. Those passed to their heirs. And there's no finder's fee either, right? Because who benefits if you do have a seizure? It's the crown, as usual. Then as now, folks, as we know, on every April 15th, it's the government that gets all the money, right? So sorry, that doesn't really work either. That doesn't say that there wasn't conflict between neighbors and that people might not have accused their neighbors because they didn't like him or they were arguing over a property boundary. But yep, wasn't over, hey, if I accuse those people that have the nice farm over there, like the nurses, I'll get their farm. Didn't work that way. So that gives you some of my ideas. But what I really want to talk about for the rest of the evening is the failure of leadership. And to some degrees, I got interested in writing on the witch trials because I really wanted to look at the judges and the other people involved, the key decision makers. And in fact, my book is written as a part of Oxford University Press's Pivotal Moments in American History. And it really kinds of looks at key decisions and not really counterfactual history, but, could things have changed? And I think, we're going to look at a bunch of people that could have made some different decisions and things would have changed drastically. It really is a failure of leaders at all levels. And it starts with Reverend Samuel Parris, who in 1692 is the minister of Salem Village. And frankly, Samuel Parris is a professional failure at everything he tried in life. He attends Harvard, which should set him up to be a success in the 17th century and to be a well-paid minister. He doesn't graduate. He is the son of our Barbados sugar planter and inherits a Barbados plantation, which again, pretty much guarantees him to be wealthy. He fails at that and loses most of the family fortune in ways that we still don't fully understand. So he comes back to Boston to try to be a merchant. And again, who are the wealthiest people in Boston? The merchants. People get rich being a merchant, not Samuel Parris. He fails at that. So here it is, 1689, and he's hired by Salem Village to be the minister. And it's almost an act of desperation on both sides because he'll be their fourth minister since they started hiring ministers in 1672. Salem Village is a rural frontier backwater with low pay, but it is really Parris's last chance at a decent life and the respect that he's convinced that he deserves. Well, again, the other ministers left under difficult circumstances, and he will too. In October 1691, there's a new village committee elected, and the majority of it are Parris's opponents. And they don't really have the ability to fire him. That's one of the problems here. No one really knows who has the ability to hire and fire the minister. But what they do know is they have the ability to stop collecting the money and to pay him the tithes and to pay him his salary. And also, too, the agreement to supply firewood for his house. They stopped doing that, too. And he begins preaching these fire and brimstone sermons, demanding moral reformation, basically saying that God is terribly angry and has let Satan loose into the colony, very martial, warlike sermons. And he's basically convinced that his enemies are in league with Satan and then they are in Salem Village. And he's storming around the parsonage, practicing his sermons. It may be cold because there's not enough firewood. There may not be enough food because he doesn't have his salary. And whether Parris realizes it or not, he is probably terrifying his daughter and his niece, as they hear him ranting and screaming about Satan coming and prepare ye sinners before it is too late, and all this sort of stuff. So perhaps it's not surprising that they become the first afflicted, right? And then guess what? Who do they accuse? They accuse their enslaved woman, Tituba, a Native American woman who's been enslaved by Paris, probably Native American from the Caribbean. We're not entirely sure about Tituba's history, but she seems unlikely to be an African, as has been suggested by some folks. And when she's one of the first three to be accused, Tituba and Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne, Tituba has a day of testimony, and she kind of goes like, doesn't really say much. But then the next day, she opens up and really spills the beans and confesses to being a witch. She does this probably, we think, after Reverend Parris may have beat her. Particularly that second day, they talk about marks and bite marks and things being on her arm, right? Or scratches. And so, it's really possible that Parris may have made her think that she'd be better off confessing to be a witch and to cooperating. Even though, again, for any confession of witchcraft, ultimately the punishment should be death. And to make matters worse, then, Tituba is so terrified, they said, now the Puritans were very much people of the book and contract. So they think that Satan, their description of Satan is someone who carries a book around with it, and if you want to become one of his minions, you need to sign a contract, sign his book with your own blood. And so they say, okay, so you saw Satan and he tortured you until you convinced to sign his book. When you signed, did you see any other names? And she said, yeah, I saw 9 names. Wait a second, you and Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne. So there are at least 6 more. So, well, this is when Salem ceases to be that small witch hunt of only 1 or 2 people that might go away. And this and all the other factors going on make it take off into a full-blown witch hunt. And again, really all in large part, I attribute much of this to Samuel Parris and his behavior. This guy, pastors are supposed to have pastoral sort of practice. This guy was confrontational. And again, really was the wrong minister for this job at that time. And I'll tell you what, he even after his children are afflicted and they're starting to be maybe brought before the court for testimony, what does Parris do? He agrees to record testimony for the court, some of the trial hearings. So he becomes one of the officers of the court, rather than someone that's trying to heal his community and console those who might have been accused. He's taking a very adversarial role. So I hope, Parris could have done things very, very differently. And again, I think if he had sort of protected Tituba, we never would have had a huge witch hunt. So that's one. So I hold Samuel Parris, the blame pie, he gets a good piece. But I'll say, I think a bigger piece probably goes to the 9 judges, or at least 8 of those judges. Now, there's so many things going wrong in the colony that the judges clearly, in this case, presume guilt from the start. Now, this is odd because, again, this sounds like a kangaroo court rather than good English justice, which these judges usually dispensed. But if you look on the first day of questioning, the first questions posed to Sarah Good, one of the 3 accused, by Judge Haythorne. Yes, that is Nathaniel Hawthorne's direct ancestor. What are the questions he leads with? What evil spirit have you familiarity with? Have you made no contract with the devil? Why do you hurt these children? And he might as well ask, when did you stop beating your husband, right? These are all leading questions. These are not the kind of ways English or New England judges behave. Now, fair to say that judges, there were no lawyers in Massachusetts in the 17th century, but judges were there to ferret out the truth. They questioned both the accused and the accusers and the witnesses to protect the innocent and to punish the guilty. But in this case, they clearly come in basically knowing that Satan is here. And I really was interested in trying to figure out who are these judges and why are they hanging judges? Why are they behaving like this? Because you know what, folks? We have juries here. We have grand juries. We have trial juries of 12 men. And again, good leading citizens who are the jurists. The juries. And so how do they become, how does things go so wrong? Because again, as we know, then as now, you can have juries that might make a wrong decision. But it takes learned smart judges, in this case, a panel of judges, to agree to go along with the verdict, to not vacate it, and to sign the death warrant, right? So why do they do this? Why are they hanging judges? And in fact, even more than that, why do they turn legal precedent on its head? Before 1692, if you confess to witchcraft, and that's usually, by the way, after mild, put that in quotes, judicial torture, maybe kind of like the 17th century equivalent of waterboarding, right? We know that's happened. John Proctor talks about his son and two other boys being tied neck and heels, and basically sort of, trussed up and then held by their belt with their head down till blood gushed out their nose. At which point they may have thought that, yeah, maybe I am going to die, and even though you're probably not, but maybe I should change my mind about that, saying I'm not a witch, because better to be around for a while than to be like just to die right here from some sort of torture, right? So before 1692, if you confess to being a witch, you are usually tried, convicted, sentenced, and executed. No questions asked. That's it. The one question they do ask, though, and this happened in 1688, the last person to be executed for witchcraft, an Irish woman, Goody Glover, in Boston, confesses to witchcraft and is executed. But before that execution, the judges say, wait a second, we need to have her meet privately with a panel of doctors, physicians, to make sure that she is of sound mind. Because if she's just an old lady who's not mentally well and is saying she's a witch because of that, well, of course we're not going to kill her, execute her. That would be wrong. But in this case, they decide that yes, she knew what she was doing. Part of the problem here, honestly, is she's Irish and she probably only speaks Gaelic and probably was not well served by the translators of the day. But again, they took that extra step. It was important. Before you execute someone who confesses to witchcraft, which you're going to do. But guess what? This to me is the real horror of Salem. In 1692, only those who refuse to confess are executed, right? All of the 55 people who confess live, ultimately. Now, having said this, at the time when you confess, they may have thought they were going to die eventually. But by late summer, when the people who confessed are still alive, and all the people who have said not guilty are being tried and executed, made people think, I suspect, right? So that's over a third, 35% of the people formally accused confess and live. And by the way, no one's bothering to question their sanity either as to why did you confess. Meanwhile, the court of warrior interminer will try 28 people, and they find a jury has found all 28 guilty and sentenced to death. And so, again, to some degrees, anybody who dared plead not guilty when the judges knew better faced the full wrath of the court and the jury, right? And particularly, too, the 9 judges had a lot in common. And also, too, they were led by William Stoughton, the Chief Justice. But these guys were all wealthy merchants. They're all members of the Governor's Council who've been in the initial charter, who've been put in that position by the king and the queen. Today, this would be our state senate. And they were all supporters of this campaign for moral reformation or finding our way back to God. A majority had attended Harvard, but none were ministers. And I think that's important. But particularly, too, Stoughton is important because he's the leader here. And he actually had been a minister in England back in the 1650s. Particularly, the trial of Rebecca Nurse is a turning point because she's a very saintly member of the Puritan Church, a beloved grandmother. And the jury initially in her trial comes back with a verdict of not guilty. But Stoughton, long story short, says, I don't think you looked at some of this evidence quite so closely. Why don't you ask her about this? Why don't you ask her about that? Ultimately, the jury reconsiders the verdict and convicts her, and she will be executed, even though, again, dozens of people signed petitions saying, Rebecca Nurse is a good woman. She's not a witch. But the problem is at this point, basically, if Stoughton could get the jury to reconsider so that anybody could be found guilty of witchcraft, all bets were off. And at that point, all kinds of people get accused in Massachusetts. Again, if Stoughton had gone along with that verdict, that would have probably been the end of the trials or close to it. So I think in 1692, what's going on is that a lot of these ministers, again, at least these guys had started as kids, wanted to be ministers and gone to Harvard with that in mind. Yet they found themselves as successful merchants, wealthy merchants, not ministers. And I think maybe they sort of questioned about that all their lives. But finally, in 1692, they understood why God had chosen a different path for them. And that was simply because in 1692, God knew it would be the judges, the merchants, not the ministers, who could save the colony by rounding up the witches and executing them. And they were far too good at that job. I'd also like to point out there's real groupthink going on here because, sometimes we kid about nepotism on Beacon Hill. Well, guess what, folks? 6 of the 9 judges are related by marriage. And in fact, their nephew is the sheriff of Essex County, the guy seizing property. So maybe some things don't necessarily change all that much, huh? So again, I think they're very deferential to, they're all part of a group, a class. They're all deferential to Stoughton and they follow his lead and everybody's guilty. And they're going to go along with the verdict and urge Stoughton to sign the death warrant. Part of the problem too, again, is this war that's going on the frontier. And in 1692, it really looked like the end of the colony. Interesting thing here, though. Most of those judges are high-ranking militia officers. In fact, Colonel Waite Winthrop, grandson of John Winthrop, is one of the 9 judges. And he's commander-in-chief of the Massachusetts Army that's losing this war. So these guys are responsible for the failure of the war. They're representatives of the government. They're representatives of the military as well. So, and unfortunately, human nature is to look at other people to blame and sort of own up like, maybe if we'd done a better job of running the colony or running this war, we wouldn't be in this mess. And most of them had suffered directly. Most were major land speculators in frontier lands. They owned sawmills that had been destroyed. So these were angry hanging judges looking for someone to hold up as being guilty of crimes. Really, if you think about it, folks, if your state senators are also your judges, are also running your militia, way too much power in the hands of too few people. Other things the judges do wrong. Normally, when someone issues an accusation, they have to post bond, usually a fairly substantial bond, to avoid essentially what we call today nuisance suits, right? They didn't do this until really towards the end of the witch trials, where it happens like once, as far as we can tell. Again, we don't know why, but they didn't, and that would have stopped a lot of these accusations. They also give far more credence to spectral evidence than they should. And the ministers for their part, matter of fact, that's what separates Salem from other witchcraft crises. Spectral evidence is really acceptable and is used to help convict everybody. In other cases, it's very controversial. It's not used. And in this case, the judges asked the ministers, so what about spectral evidence? Should we use it? Well, the ministers kind of deferential. They kind of say a couple of times during the summer in letters they write, particularly Cotton Mather, they say, well, you got to be really careful with this stuff. It's not great. Don't use it as your primary evidence. But then they also are very deferential to the judges and say, but you're doing fine. Keep up the good work. At which point the judges go, okay. So again, between the judges and the ministers of the colony, they should have been much more strongly allied against spectral evidence than they were. One guy did get it right, which is just to show you again, too, that, that things could have gone a different way. Judge Nathaniel Saltonstall of Haverhill, Colonel Saltonstall, another high-ranking militia officer, by the way, living on the absolute edge of the frontier in Haverhill in 1692. He leaves the court in June 1692 after the conviction and execution of Bridget Bishop. We don't have any more detail about that, but it seems, reading between the lines, we all pretty much feel that Saltonstall was really resigning in protest, that he was disgusted with the way the court was proceedings and did not want to be a part of it anymore. By the way, there's a good play that's been developed in the past couple of years called Saltonstall's Trials, which I highly recommend if you get a chance to see it, which talks about Saltonstall and his role in the witch trials. So the buck ultimately stops with the governor, and I, again, in the blame pie, I hold him very responsible for what's going on. I actually co-authored a biography of Sir William. That's one of the first entrees I had to the Salem witch trials. And so I know him well, and I really think he's largely responsible for what took place in 1692, ultimately, because he could have stopped it, right? Phipps writes a letter to the king and the queen for the first time since he arrived as governor in May. He writes to them in October, basically warning them that for the first time about the witch hunt and the witch trials. And in the letter, he takes the real easy path. What's he do? He blames his deputy governor, Stoughton, the chief justice of the witch trials. Now, interestingly, about the same time, Stoughton was plotting behind Phipps's back to overthrow him and become governor, but that's another whole story. No honor amongst thieves there, I guess, right? He writes, I was almost the whole time of the proceedings abroad in the service of their majesties in the eastern parts of the country and depended upon the judgment of the court. I was away in Maine fighting the war, building Fort William Henry at Pemaquid, defending the frontier against the Wabanaki. So, I left Stoughton in charge, and wow, God, I made a huge mistake. I trusted him and the judges to do the right thing. Well, guess what? I went back and looked at Phipps's day-to-day activities. And he did make a couple trips to Maine and was up there in September. But he could have attended all of the sessions of the court of Oyer and Terminer when they were in session in the summer, in June, July, August, and September of 1692. And he chose not to. He wanted to be as far away from this as possible because he saw it as I think, as a ultimately losing political issue. In part, I guess, because maybe like being soft on crime, no one wants to be soft on witches, right? In 1692. Especially, by the way, when there's a chance that Phipps's own family might face accusation because of their kind of checkered background, because he was a treasure hunter from Maine, late conversion to the Puritan cause, kind of outsider who might get accused for witchcraft. Indeed, when he comes home in October, he writes to the crown, when I came home, I found that the devil had taken upon him the name and shape of several persons who were doubtless innocent. Well, who are you talking about, William? Could it be the fact that your wife has been cried out upon and also the wife of your top advisor, Increase Mather? They've been cried out upon as being witches. Now, they were never formally accused, but at this point, Phipps says, okay, that's it. We're calling a halt to these proceedings. Not after 19 people has been executed, but after his wife's been accused, right? Yeah, and then blame Stoughton. Brilliant. So, shall I say, a politician who's not entirely truthful? Yeah, there's a long history of that. So Phipps actually encourages Cotton Mather to write a book about the witch trials, and he encourages and he includes a copy of this book, Wonders of the Invisible World, with his letter to the king and the queen. And basically Phipps and Stoughton together say, Cotton, you need to help us out. We basically need some cover here. So the book is a whitewash. If Mather was alive today, he'd be a spin doctor on Sunday morning talk shows. It's horrible. He says no innocent lives were lost, but he only looks at like 4 or 5 cases where there's really overwhelming evidence of people that probably might have been convicted of witchcraft in London at that time, right? And he ignores the other cases. See, no innocent lives were lost. At which point Phipps says, see, here's the eminent Cotton Mather's book, kid who graduated from Harvard at 16 and is brilliant. And take his word. And by the way, now that we have the truth from Cotton Mather, we don't need any other books or writings on the witch trials because we've got the truth, right? So he also tells the crown, I'm issued a publication ban, no more books on the witch trials, because the government cannot face this inextinguishable flame of controversy and criticism. Basically, Phipps is afraid he'll lose his job and that the government of Massachusetts will fall. Now, that also might have meant the end of the Puritan experiment in New England and a return to really the quite horrible days of like the Dominion of New England and Edmund Andros. But let's face it, there's a lot of self-interest here on Phipps's part. So I give him a big part of the blame pie. So the result, yeah, that publication ban, the first large-scale government cover-up in U.S. history, the first large-scale really failure to protect innocent lives. So well before Nixon, folks, we had cover-ups. And in this case, they were actually involving people who had actually died, right? Not just a break-in at a nice hotel. The publication ban lasted a full 3 years. And in the meantime, there are still over 100 people in jail awaiting trial after Phipps ends the witch trials court. So in January 1693, they established a new court to deal with this backlog of cases. it will be the first sitting of the Massachusetts Superior Court of Judicature, which today is the Supreme Court of Judicature. That is today our Supreme Court in Massachusetts. One difference in this case, Phipps now forbids the use of spectral evidence. And guess what? No one's convicted. Well, there'll be 3 women who confess because they think that's the best thing to do. In this case, Phipps reverses their attainder, pardons them. And so no more lives are lost, but the trials last through the spring of 1693. So finally, some people say, William Phipps, he brought the witch trials to an end. He's my hero. I was like, yeah, he should have brought them to the end about 6 months earlier, right? Unfortunately. So the witch, in the aftermath, we can sort of see that people agreed with who to blame. The witch hunt showed the people's growing displeasure with the clergy. During the witch trials, I dug into this and I found out that a lot of the people who weren't formally accused but were cried out upon were ministers. And a lot of the people accused of witchcraft were relatives of ministers. So in total, 5 ministers and 45 kin of ministers were accused of witchcraft in 1692. Again, a huge percentage of the accused were related to ministers. Now, of these, George Burroughs is the only one formally charged, and of course he dies, but also Samuel Willard, the minister of South Church in Boston, Jeremiah Shepherd, minister in Lynn, Francis Dane in Andover, who had over 20 members of his family accused, John Buss, Durham, New Hampshire. All of these ministers will be accused. There's a tremendous amount of anger and resentment towards the clergy in 1692. And again, I think a lot of it has to do with them not solving the problems, these local problems, and helping them, the witches come into the community, right? Because in fact, in a satanic mass, you need someone like a minister to lead the black masses, and a lot of them saw these guys in that role. Also, too, people were really angry at their political leaders. In 1693, Massachusetts has its annual elections to the General Court. The General Court is our state legislature. It's still called that today, right? The Great and General Court of Massachusetts Bay. And in the House, more than half of the 72 members will be new in 1693, and there'll be 10 new members of the 28-member council, essentially the upper body, the Senate. This is unheard of turnover in the General Court, a body that almost never had any turnover unless someone died or decided that they were too old to do it. Huge displeasure by the voters, the adult property-owning males of Massachusetts Bay. As for Phipps, they can't touch him because, of course, he's appointed by the king, but they will make constant complaints about him. They'll accuse him of all sorts of conflict of interest, of profiting at the government's expense. Some of the charges are pretty crazy, that he was like in league with pirates, which is nonsense, but some others that might have had some bearing. So in 1694, he's recalled to England by the king and the queen, and he really in disgrace, and he dies in England a couple months later before he has a chance to really defend himself against those charges. Would have been, I really wish he'd lived to I'm really interested to see what he would have said to all the charges against him. So that's, I've said more than enough. I want to leave some time for some questions. So Catherine and Emily, I'll turn it back over to you, and thanks folks for listening.
Well, thank you. That's been fascinating. And it's extraordinary how many different elements were at play in this tragedy. So we have several questions already in the chat, and I invite people to please put their questions also in the chat. The first is, it seems that the Puritans believed as the Catholics did. Did they believe in all that the Malleus Maleficarum claimed? And the Malleus Maleficarum, if I'm correct, is like the hammer of evil, and it was the
Right.
Yeah.
The Hammer of Witches is basically a 16th century German witch hunting manual. I will say this: what's interesting about if you read the Malleus, some might call it a medieval sex manual, honestly, because in Europe, witchcraft is really defined, and actually everywhere is defined in part. How you show your allegiance to Satan, first off, is by having sex with him. Interestingly, the Puritans don't really emphasize that part of it. So in that sense, they are very puritanical. But absolutely the belief. And if you look where there is like religious conflict or religious radicalism, that's where you see the strongest witchcraft accusations. Because in Europe, on the continent, in Germany and France, it's those same areas that are afflicted, sort of those tension areas between Protestants and Catholics in conflict, areas where there's all sorts of religious wars in France, or the 30 Years' War in England, in Germany and Central Europe. And also too, the Puritans seem to be, again, as radical Protestants, seem to be particularly susceptible as well because of their strong religious beliefs. Of all of the colonies in North America, 2 of them have real problems with witch hunts. One is Massachusetts. The other is Bermuda, where, yeah, guess what? There were a lot of Puritans amongst the first settlers of Bermuda. So there certainly is a correlation. But again, witchcraft is also a universal. There are a few cases in places like Maryland and Virginia. And in fact, one woman is actually put to death on a ship headed for Virginia when she's accused of really causing the storm that is almost causing the ship to be lost. So there certainly is a correlation. And also another place too, where it's strong Calvinist population in Scotland, lots of witch hunts there as well too.
Yeah. We have from Melissa Bennett, in my own family history, I have several ancestors and their relatives who were charged with witchcraft in and around Salem. The surnames are Hawks, Wardwell, Rowe, and Vinson. Can you talk a little bit about the family dynamics in this community? It seems many of the accused were related in various ways, and my research gets overwhelming very quickly when I start to try to figure out all these familial connections.
Yeah, it absolutely is. Well, you have to remember, first off, you had a lot fewer population. The whole population of Salem and Salem Village is probably only about 2,500 people at that time, maybe 500 in the village, a couple thousand in the sort of downtown Salem, if you will. So families have been there for 2 or 3 generations with big families in many cases. A lot of people, you really tightly connected and interconnected. And many of these families had come over together from their home villages in England. So absolutely, there are a lot of people that are connected together. And yes, witchcraft was believed to travel in families. And once you had one member of a family accused, you would have lots more. And I mentioned like in Andover, where you had literally, I think it's 28 members of the Dane family, Reverend Francis Dane's family, his daughters, granddaughters, nieces, nephews, grandchildren, who are accused of witchcraft. So certainly it sort of seems to spread through the family connections. Proctor family is another family like that as well too. Once you have one member of the family, or the Town sisters are maybe the most famous because Bridget Bishop and not Bridget Bishop, I'm sorry, Mary Eastie, Sarah Cloyce, and of course Rebecca Nurse, all 3 accused sisters, and the only one who survives is Sarah. So yeah, there's a lot of genealogical research on this. There are a number of different organizations that have sort of family associations that actually study, they've done a lot of research on the witch trials, like the Town family. So you might want to just take a look on Facebook. There are a number of groups for some of the descendants of the victims of the witch trials.
Thank you. We have Phipps already had a dodgy track record between the failed siege of Quebec and the frontier warfare in 1691 and 2. Other than being rich and willing to toe the Mather party line, did he have any qualifications as a governor?
No.
Okay.
Short answer, no. And in fact, people weren't even sure he would toe the party line because he'd only converted and become a member of the Mathers Church really around 1690 to be able to lead those failed military expeditions. He lost the Quebec expedition. Massachusetts lost at least 4 ships and hundreds of lives, bankrupted the colony, and failed to take Quebec. His key qualification was, he was seen sort of as this hero figure. It's funny because I think some people really sort of, including series editor David Hackett Fisher, might thought that I was, he said actually in his initial comments to me when he saw the draft of the book, I think you're being a little harsh on Phipps here, but then again, you're his biographer, so if anybody knows him, and I'm going like, yeah, I'm sorry, I find it hard to defend this guy. He was borderline literate. He was had no kind of, he was really a man of action, if anything. He was easily taken in by the French, and actually some French guys that he welcomed to Salem or to Boston were actually spies, we find out later. So he really is his job. He was not a good governor, and only really made things worse. And frankly, as I sort of say point out in the book, his wife Mary was Lady Mary Phipps was kind of the brains of the operation. Yeah, that's that's the short answer. We can tell you what, some other time we can talk about Phipps all night, because he's a fascinating guy, right? He's the first American to to successfully raise a Spanish treasure galleon, and probably the richest guy in the colony, self-made man, but not so much for governor.
Wow. To know him is to despise him, apparently. So,
Well, okay. Let me just say, I kind of have a warm spot in my heart for him. I've always pictured, if there was a movie, a biography of Phipps, because I think he's had an amazing life. He's really involved in so many strands. At one point, I consider John Reed and I call him like the Forrest Gump of the 17th century, because he's involved in all these different things. I've always wondered who'd play him in the movie. Big, heavy, larger than life character. And unfortunately, like all the people that I think would do the best job are like dead comedians, like John Belushi and John Candy. So he has a little bit of a warm spot in my heart, but let's just say, he really rose. It's the Peter principle. He really rose far above where he should have been.
Salem is known for the witch hunt. How many more towns had it on a lesser scale and are less generally known?
Yeah, well, as I say, there in Massachusetts alone, there are over 100 people accused. And let's see, I don't think there are no formal accusations of charges in Plymouth Colony, only 1 or 2 in Middlesex, quite a few in Suffolk, quite a few in Essex, quite a few out in the Connecticut River Valley, down into Connecticut, Hartford, New Haven. And actually, you can go through, if you look at, if you go to like John Demos's Entertaining Satan, he's got a list of all the people accused. And it's like a laundry list of 17th century New England towns, including, by the way, Long Island, which at the time was some of the settlements on Long Island were actually settled by New Englanders and Puritans. And in fact, one of the chapters of Entertaining Satan by John Demos takes place out on Long Island in the 17th century. So yeah, most of them, but having said that, most of these are 1 or 2 people. The only kind of other major outbreak is in Hartford in the like late 1650s, early 1660s, where I think about a dozen people are accused and several do end up dying. But for the most part, it's sort of scattered because again, I guess I would say, if you don't have that failure in leadership, you only have 1 or 2 people who are accused, and then it sort of dies down. And again, throughout Europe, hundreds and hundreds of towns where they're accused witches. I mean, the place I like to point out is Cologne, Germany, a 10-year witch hunt between 1626 and 1635. We think about 2,000 people died. And, again, like Cologne's this beautiful city, wonderful cathedral. I've enjoyed going there, and no one talks about witches, right? It's all Salem. So I think Salem gets the notoriety in part because the fall from grace was so great, from the Puritan ideal of a city upon a hill, right? Here's this largest outbreak of witchcraft. So Salem takes a lot of the blame, but it was a pretty universal phenomenon.
We have one question that points to the setting in 1692 being strikingly similar to the world today. Climate change and political instability, economic instability, military challenges, and we've also had a pandemic.
Yeah.
Why then don't we have more people suffering from mass conversion disorder? What would you point to as potentially different enough then compared to now? Or is an epidemic of mass conversion disorder on the horizon?
Well, I'm not sure if we have mass conversion disorder or not, but I will say that the parallels to the past, at least 5-10 years of American history to me are scary. There are parallels throughout American history. Every generation tends to have its Salem movement. And again, to me, a lot of this is, it's about social justice. And honestly, it's about scapegoating, of finding other people to blame for your problems, of not accepting their version of reality and their truth, right? Of looking for people to blame. Think about this. Think about, and this is how I actually in Storm of Witchcraft. Imagine that you live in a land, by the way, where the highest political figure is a newcomer to your cause, is not well educated. You really wonder if he's the right person for the job and has the track record to do it. But far worse than that, you're beset with this horrible problem, this group that wants to destroy you, that wants to kill your family, wipe out your village, destroy your faith, make you go away. Well, great. How do we stop them? Well, don't worry, the government's doing it. But we don't know who these people are. They could be anybody, could be even a member of your family or your minister or your representative to the general court. It could be anybody. That could be a witch. We just don't know who they are, right? Well, don't worry. The government's taking care of it. All right. Well, I'm not so sure about this. Well, basically, folks, if you take that witch in the 17th century, and again, witchcraft in the 17th century and witches have nothing to do with today with the modern religion of Wicca, which is a wonderful pacifistic religion that believes in being nice to people and animals in the earth. But if you look at that 17th century version of that witch in league with Satan trying to harm people, and you swap that witch with our modern day issue of terrorist, I think you understand how real the problem was, right? Where you don't, there's a problem, because again, witches were real in 1692. These were not superstitious folk. The witches are in the Bible. These are God-fearing people. It's before the age of science. Everybody, popes, there were no atheists then. Everybody was religious, and everybody believed in witches because it's in the Bible, right? And witches get their power from Satan, who gets their power from God. So if you deny the example of witches, are you questioning that? So long way of saying, you have a society that is looking for people to scapegoat, to rushing to judgment, basically in their own kind of bubbles and their own communities and pockets, and not being able to sort of meet across party lines, if you will, really, and talk about the differences and get multiple different sources of information. As historians, we try to look at all the information and try to examine arguments and look at the evidence, right? And I think, frankly, we're all probably all of us are, at one time or another, a little bit guilty about not doing that, of not trying to understand how people who disagree with us feel and what legitimate points they have and how do we reach common ground. So, maybe not PTSD, but I clearly feel the sort of the rancor, the political divide, the military issues we're dealing with, from the war on terror, you name it. We have a lot of the same factors. And yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if we didn't have a case of PTSD or mass conversion disorder. And particularly too, we know that actually a few years ago in a school in Danvers High School, there actually was a small case of conversion disorder. Believe it or not, that is actually true, right? So it happens. Keep your eyes open.
We've had a couple of comments referring to the fact that now we do have an acceptance of the need for mental health care, and more people have access to it, so stress can be processed in a different way. We have two questions that relate to gender, and the first is, since witchcraft was a gendered crime, were women who displayed agency or had power typically accused since they didn't fit the gender dynamics of the time? And maybe conversely, why do you think the women who were afflicted were then given so much power in these trials? Was there precedent for this in other witch trials?
So on the first one, we're absolutely talking about a patriarchal society. So women who don't fit the mold are under threat, and particularly, I would say, smart women. The most dangerous thing to the Puritans was a smart, devout Puritan woman. And Exhibit A being Anne Hutchinson. Now we're going back in time here to the mid 1630s, and the so-called antinomian crisis, the Puritans called it. Basically, again, even the name sort of trying to discredit, which basically suggesting that Anne Hutchinson and her followers were essentially like bomb-throwing atheists, which they were not, or anarchists, referring to a 16th century group, a really radical group in Europe. But Anne Hutchinson does have a slightly different view of all of the differences between the Puritans and the different groups are all over salvation, right? And the degree to which predestination plays the role. Because of course, good deeds play almost no role, really, technically no role to Puritans. But Anne Hutchinson has a slightly different view, and she's very smart and she knows her Bible, and she begins to hold hold, prayer meetings and meetings where they read the Bible together. And she's smart. She knows her stuff. She's from a very important family. She was well educated, well spoken, and she's essentially tossed out of the colony for her beliefs. But also, too, amongst what do they do in the Indian when they throw her out of the colony? She actually gives birth very, very prematurely to a child, which they call a monstrous birth, and basically claim that it's the spawn of Satan. And eventually she's kind of, amongst other things, sort of accused of witchcraft, right? So yeah, smart, dangerous women certainly posed a threat. Now, having said that, most times witchcraft is a working class crime that starts on the wrong side of the tracks. And you get, those women sort of cursing each other and blaming each other for their problems, and it kind of escalates into counter charges of curses and witchcraft. But in this case, yes, it does rise up the social ladder, and frankly, all the way to the top. We don't know a lot about why and how Lady Mary Phipps was cried out upon, but here you have the leader of the leading woman of the colony, the first woman of the colony. But apparently, while her husband was away in Maine, a woman in the jail in Boston who'd been accused of witchcraft threw herself on Lady Phipps's mercy, said, "Please help me get released from prison. I'm not a witch." At which point, apparently, Lady Mary went to the jailer in Boston and said, "Release that woman." Wow, bad move, right? Because you may be the wife of the governor, you may be the wife of a knight, but you have no authority in Massachusetts. You are a woman. You can't even vote. How dare you do this? And clearly, someone thought that Lady Mary was taking on authority and positions that she didn't have. And it seems pretty clear to me that she was accused because of that, right? So there's certainly an element of that, absolutely. And also, and some of this does have to do with church politics, like Rebecca Nurse, when she's accused, a very, an elderly member of the church. But, it's really crazy because she and her husband at one point took in and sort of adopted and took in as their ward this young boy whose parents were Quakers. God forbid that Puritans would have anything to do with Quakers. And again, another weird paranoia of the Puritans. To the second half of that question, sort of the afflicted in power, this is really interesting dynamic that we sort of play with, is where, again, normally the youngest girls could not even testify in court, like if you're 12 or under, but almost never would you see teenagers accusing and showing up and testifying in court. And clearly they become center stage in the witch trials. And, how that happens is an interesting process that a lot of historians have different ideas upon, as to clearly the officials were to some degrees, I think, using them and allowing them to testify because it suited them. And also, too, it clearly, I think, suited a lot of these teenage girls to be in a position where everybody, including the judges and the ministers, are hanging on their very words. So there's a really interesting dynamic there, and I think a lot more research that can be done on that dynamic between the afflicted and the accused. For if someone's looking to write the next book, because you know what, there's never going to be the perfect book on the witch trials. It's going to keep on going because we always have new ways of looking at it. And anybody who thinks they've written the book, sadly mistaken.
Well, I think that's a really good place to stop. We're coming up on an hour and a half. And I think what the conversation both here and in the chat is showing is that this is an incredibly complicated story. It is very, very nuanced, and there is no simple explanation, but that's what makes it so interesting and important. Thank you so much, Tad, for being with us tonight. This was wonderful and interesting. And again, I really encourage everyone to read the book, because as much as we covered here tonight, there's so much more in there. So thank you, everybody. Have a really wonderful evening.